In our last question and answer session, we addressed in particular some questions that pertained to the meaning of Brit, or in rough English translation, covenant, as it appears in the Bible. And we did something of an overview of what Brit, covenant, means in the Bible that serves as a kind of background for the questions that we hope to address today. Admittedly, I hoped to at least begin addressing them last time, but time limitations prevented that. So I hope we can, at the very least, look forward to considering these additional questions that pertain to covenants at present. So without any further ado, let's consider the first of these questions, and we'll have another couple that pertain specifically to a passage in Isaiah. More the general issue first. You have spoken often of the Noahide covenant, which applies to all the nations of the world. Does this mean that the covenant of the Torah does not? What role do non-Jewish people and nations have in keeping the rules of living that are in the Torah? So, certainly an important question to address, especially in light of, as noted in the question, the extent to which I have frequently spoken of the Noahide covenant, and indeed we mentioned it last time as well, since it is the first instance in which we encounter the word and idea of a covenant in the Bible. So perhaps the most germane thing to do at present is to, initially at least, review just what that Noahide covenant is. And while we have noted this in the past, I think a bit of review on this score is also helpful. As we have noted, an understanding of the rules in the Noahide covenant can, I think, best be addressed by considering the three components of life: the world inside, the world outside, and the meaning beyond, that correspond respectively to self, others, and God. And it is in that vein that we can well consider the actual components of the covenant, corresponding to the relationship with others, a prohibition on murder, and a prohibition on theft. Corresponding to a relationship with God, then of course our striving to refine that relationship, a prohibition on idolatry, that is, deifying what is manifestly not divine, and a prohibition on blasphemy, which means cursing God in God's name, which, as we've noted, is a veritable absurdity. That is, if one believes in God, one should not be cursing him, and if not, one should not be cursing in his name. Hence, again, the prohibition of blasphemy. And finally, with respect to cultivating an appropriate relationship with self, that path to godliness entails a prohibition on sexual immorality, lewdness, fornication, and a prohibition on eating a limb or blood of a living animal. As we have noted in the past, undoubtedly this list, at least several prominent components of it, is one that is familiar to all Christian Bible believers, in particular from Acts chapter 15, but as we've also noted in the past, that's not something I should be discussing with you. That's something regarding which you are strongly encouraged to speak with your pastors. In any case, these are the 6 prohibitions of the Noahide laws, followed by a 7th, which is to establish courts for the enforcement of the other 6. And they represent, from our perspective as Jews, the basis of moral, ethical living for all of humanity. Because, of course, all of humanity is, by definition, Noahide, descendants of Noah. And, of course, inevitably then, to that extent, appreciating the thrust of the Noahide laws and ultimately the implications that they have for all those who adhere to them, this is what we regard as the principal legacy that pertains to all of humanity. We discussed this at length when regarding Genesis chapter 9 in the series on the 5 books of Moses. We spoke of the legacy of Noah. And I stress, with apologies because I know I've stressed this on many occasions in the past, that from our perspective, those who uphold the Noahide laws have attained, as a result, a share in everlasting life, personal salvation, and contributing to the ultimate redemption of the world. I stress this point, as I have on many occasions in the past, because it obviously informs our policy of in no way encouraging Bible-believing Christians to abandon their faith, since it is through that faith that, again, they are attaining all those wonderful objectives: everlasting life, personal salvation, contributing to the redemption of the world. So why should we possibly be interested in dissuading them from upholding the beliefs that underlie those essential actions? Okay, so having stated this then, having reviewed what we mean by the Noahide covenant, and having then recognized that we make no attempt to impose upon the world anything other than these components of the Noahide covenant, the question that's asked here is, does this mean that the covenant of the Torah does not apply to the nations of the world? And the answer inevitably is nuanced. Nuanced in the sense that if you ask, is the covenant of the Torah binding on the nations of the world? My response to that is just consider the way God begins the Decalogue in both Exodus chapter 20 and in the review of the Decalogue in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The words with which the Decalogue begins, 10 Commandments. I am God your Lord, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. And of course, by obvious extension, then, those rules, and in generality, all the rules of living that the Torah comprises, are binding on all those who are party to the experience of the Exodus. On the most basic plane, because only they can be held accountable based upon the conviction that they have through their experience, either for that generation, its personal experience, or for all generations, their historical experience, that indeed God commanded them concerning the rules of conduct that are in the Torah, that are in the 5 books of Moses. To the extent that the rest of the world was not in any direct sense, or even a direct historical sense, party to that experience, it would be unfair to consider them bound by rules that derive from that experience. And so, as a matter of historic fact, and more so determined religious policy. Judaism does not believe in attempting to impose its beliefs upon others. Besides, again, the Noahide covenant, because the Noahide covenant is the basis of moral, ethical living, and everyone, without exception, we believe has the wherewithal to reach that appreciation that these rules constitute the basis of an equitable, decent, meaningful society. So these, then, everyone is deemed capable of accepting, as opposed to the covenant of the Torah, that again is binding only on Israel. But having stated that, does that mean that the covenant of the Torah doesn't apply to the rest of the world? Well, that's a different question. Obviously, to the extent that individuals from among the nations of the world are interested, of their own volition, and we stress volition, in accepting upon themselves these rules of living, they're certainly welcome to do so. I should, however, add an important caveat here. As a matter of well-known information, in particular in the food industry in the United States, it is well established that the number of consumers of exclusively kosher products numbers several millions of people, of whom undoubtedly a minority are Jewish. As for the motivations of the people who are adhering to the dietary laws of the Torah, they are undoubtedly of many different colors and hues. There are those who are convinced, rightly or wrongly, that kosher food is cleaner, purer, less given to various additives, and for any of a number of reasons, healthier than unkosher cuisine. Well, it might be, but it is important for us to stress that while people are welcome, of course, to consume kosher food, we don't regard consuming kosher food because of its supposed health benefits to be a devotional act to God. Well, of course, we wouldn't regard consuming kosher food by Jews simply because of supposed health benefits as an act of devotion to God either. The reason that we submit to God's rules as to how we should eat is because we're submitting to God. Because of our trust in God, our faith in God, and undoubtedly, to that extent, our conviction that God, in giving us these rules of living, knows very well what's best for us. Now, what's best for us undoubtedly is first and foremost what is best for us spiritually. That is, after all, the real essence of who we are. What's best for us could also certainly include what's best for us physically. But even to the extent that we might indeed accept the proposition that kosher eating is therefore healthier, we're not doing it because of our evaluation of health benefits. We leave that in God's hands. We're doing it because God commanded us. And again, I'm going to reiterate them to that extent. Certainly, while we believe all Israel, all Jews are bound by what God commands us in the covenants of the Torah, non-Jewish people and nations are certainly welcome to embrace those rules to the extent that they so desire as well. Having stated that, there is, of course, a third possibility, the first two again being only subscribing to the rules of the Noahide covenant, which is perfectly acceptable for the non-Jewish world, votively accepting upon themselves various components of the rules of living in the Torah, which non-Jewish people and nations are welcome to do, but by no means obliged to do. The third possibility is those individuals who are so inclined are welcome to join the covenant fully on their own. Joining the covenant fully on their own, becoming not only associated votively with the covenant, but becoming bound by the covenant, means becoming a proselyte, converting to the faith of Israel. I'm stressing this as a possibility, not in order to encourage the step, but only in order to stress that one shouldn't think of Israel as some kind of closed club that is open only to the native born and not available to welcome those who come from outside. Those who come from outside are indeed welcome, but they aren't encouraged, because encouraging would convey the dangerously wrong impression that a condition for salvation, for redemption, is becoming part of Israel, which it definitely is not. Now, having stated this, I should indeed affirm the extent to which the non-Jewish world is welcome to, on a votive basis, embrace the rules of living in the Torah. And perhaps one of the best ways of expressing this is with respect to the temple service, serving God in the Holy Temple, and the message that emerges quite explicitly from the prayer of dedication by King Solomon upon the completion of the Holy Temple in Kings 1, chapter 8, verses 41, 42, and 43. Moreover, concerning a stranger who is not of your people Israel, but comes out of a far country for your name's sake. For they shall hear of your great name and of your strong hand and of your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this house, hear you in heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calls to you for, that all people of the earth may know your name, to fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. I should stress two crucial observations that pertain to this passage. Of course, the first is patently obvious, that King Solomon here is referring explicitly to those who are not from the nation of Israel. And he solicits God's reply to their prayers. The other point to appreciate, admittedly a more subtle one, is that King Solomon's solicitation is to do according to all that the stranger calls upon you to do. This, in marked contrast to what we read just a couple of verses earlier. In verse 39, pertaining to the prayers that are offered by any man or all your people Israel, specifically those who are coming from the nation of Israel, regarding whom King Solomon's request of God is, give to every man according to his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the children of men. The point of note, of course, is that it is specifically with respect to the stranger that King Solomon beseeches God to give the stranger everything. Again, according to all that the stranger calls upon you to do. Why? Why the difference? For Israel, it's only to give them each man according to his ways, whose heart you know. Don't give him everything he wants. Give him exactly what he deserves. Why the distinction? Well, actually, King Solomon pretty much makes it explicit. To give the stranger according to all that the stranger calls upon you to do, that all people of the earth may know your name, to fear you as do your people Israel. Because the stranger who comes from far away hasn't had an opportunity to experience divine providence. They need to first and foremost learn of your imminence, your closeness to them. So give them everything they request. The people of Israel, they should already know. They've already had the experience. So for them, the appropriate course is what we call tough love. Don't give them everything they want. Give them exactly what they deserve. But of course, what's crucial to appreciate in this passage is that the prayers of the nations of the world are certainly by no means regarded as inferior to the prayers of Israel. If anything, arguably, one could say just the opposite. Now, I might note that King Solomon doesn't speak here of bringing offerings, such as sacrifices, contributions, to the Holy Temple. This, I must concede altogether, is a fascinating subject of discussion regarding King Solomon's prayer of dedication of the temple, because in the entire passage, he speaks exclusively about prayer and doesn't speak anywhere about bringing offerings to the temple, neither by Jews nor by non-Jews. But we do know that the non-Jewish world brought offerings to the Holy Temple. That is, I'll first note, even though admittedly it is not explicit in the text, that in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 19, we read, "They shall call the peoples of the world," plural, "to the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness," which, according to at least one classic interpretation, refers to the nations of the world coming to the Holy Temple, bringing their offerings of righteousness. More explicitly, we know very well in the Second Temple, the kings of Persia sent offerings to be brought upon the altar. And they were brought upon the altar. So there certainly was no prohibition on accepting the devotional acts of the non-Jewish world. And I stress this point because, of course, it pertains not exclusively to devotional acts that pertain to the Holy Temple, if anything on the contrary. From what we see, even regarding the Holy Temple, we can well derive that this is something that pertains to veritably all acts of devotion by the nations of the world. I'll admit there are certain caveats, certain exceptions in this regard, one of which is, at least in principle, extremely relevant this time of year, and that pertains to what we read in Exodus chapter 12, verse 48, where God instructs Moses and Aaron regarding the Paschal offering, and specifically states that no uncircumcised male shall eat of it. That requirement indeed limits the Paschal offering explicitly to Israel. There are some few similar commandments that do pertain exclusively to Israel. But in this vein, I feel compelled, I admit, uncharacteristically, to share with you a passage from the Talmud. I generally don't do that in these sessions, but this is a passage from the Jerusalem Talmud that was composed here in the land of Israel. The passage in particular is from approximately 1800 years ago, and I think it is especially germane under the circumstances. It records a conversation between the presiding sage of the nation of Israel at the time, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and the Roman prelate at the time, whose name was Antoninus. Now, Antoninus was Roman. He obviously wasn't Jewish. Moreover, this is obviously long before Constantine, so we're speaking of a Roman pagan. A Roman pagan, however, who was personally a very righteous human being and who had a close friendship with Rabbi Judah, in the course of which they often got into fascinating theological discussions, many of which are in fact recorded in the Talmud. And the passage that I'd like to share with you is Antoninus asking Rabbi Judah if he, Antoninus, would merit partaking in the banquet, metaphorically, that God sets for the righteous in the hereafter, in the world to come. And Rabbi Judah says, of course. Whereupon Antoninus exclaims, I don't understand. You told me, of course this was at a time that the temple was already in ruins, that if the temple is rebuilt and the Paschal offering is brought to the Holy Temple, I won't be able to partake of the Paschal offering. And yet you tell me that I will be able to partake of this repast that the Lord makes for the righteous in the hereafter? You would think that that would be even more exclusive. To which Rabbi Judah responds, with respect to the Paschal offering, what can I do for you? God says explicitly, one who is uncircumcised cannot partake of it. That is, there are indeed certain few precepts in God's rules of living in the Torah that contain this exclusivity, if you will. Because in this world, what can we do? There are distinctions drawn. One who is circumcised versus one who is not. But ultimately, when we speak of personal salvation, when we speak of, again, a share in everlasting life, when we speak of the final redemption of us individually and collectively, and of the world, then the barometer is righteousness, is devotion to God, not any sort of affiliation. And that undoubtedly pertains to the overwhelming majority of actions that are included in the rules of living in the Torah. I feel obliged in this regard to share with you two stories, and I may have at some point in the past mentioned them both, maybe even on more than one occasion. The first, 2 years ago, at the last biennial Forum of Christians for Israel International. The current one is taking place right now. the last one, I had a wonderful conversation on Shabbat afternoon with my dear friend Karel van Oort, the founder of Christians for Israel, and we pray that our studying the Bible together now should be for his merit, because unfortunately he isn't very well right now, and it was with very, very great regret that I learned last week he wasn't going to be able to participate in the current forum. Last time, we spent Shabbat afternoon with a wonderful conversation, and he asked me, "You're talking all the time about the Noahide laws. I taught my children about the Ten Commandments. Why?" And I responded, very much apropos of what we just discussed. You taught your children about the Ten Commandments because you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You believe that God brought forth the nation of Israel from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You indeed have inculcated into yourself and your children these beliefs that underlie your devotion to the Ten Commandments. But again, as a votive act, that's fine. To regard that as binding to all the world would necessarily be very unfair, since, after all, most of the world, probably to this day, never heard of the revelation at Sinai, never heard of the Exodus from Egypt, and may well not even have heard of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or their God. So again, the Noahide laws presume nothing, even to the extent that there are those two prohibitions that pertain to the relationship that we are summoned to have with God. They are only prohibitions. There isn't any affirmative mandate to believe in God. Just don't deify something that's not divine, that's idolatry, and don't curse God in God's name, that's blasphemy. But beyond that, expectations that would be binding to the nations of the world would again be simply unfair. So, I'm stressing the first story to emphasize the extent to which, indeed, the Noahide covenant represents a baseline and nothing more than a baseline. And my second story took place a number of years ago during the holiday of Sukkot, Tabernacles here. I was addressing a large group of Christian believers who had come from the Netherlands, and after my initial presentation, there was a very lively question and answer session, and as many of you know, that's always, for me, the best part. That's my favorite, because then we really get to get the juices flowing extemporaneously. And one of the men in the group said to me, and I think he almost had tears in his eyes as he told me, that he had been out on the streets of Jerusalem shortly before the beginning of the holiday. And I don't know how many of you have been in Jerusalem in the days before the holiday of Sukkot, but you have street vendors selling the four species, the palm branches and the citrons and the myrtle branches and the willow branches, as described in Leviticus chapter 23. Street vendors all over the place, people selling thatch for the booth, the Sukkot. It's a very lively period of the year. And he saw a boy who was selling the four species. And he asked the boy if he could hold them. And the boy said, "You're not Jewish, you can't." You should have seen the expression on his face. And I felt terribly, first of all, of course, because of the ignorance of the boy, because it would certainly have been no problem whatsoever in giving this gentleman the 4 species. And furthermore, because had I known, I would have brought the 4 species that I had from my home to offer it to each and every member of the group. If they wanted to waive the 4 species in fulfillment of the divine command, we intend and waving the 4 species in the 4 cardinal directions and upwards and downwards, that we are affirming God's dominion over the entire earth, over all the heavens. It's a wonderful experience, and I would have been happy to share it with anyone who's interested. Again, not coercion, but everyone is certainly welcome. So, by way of summation, it's critical for me to stress this point because, especially given the second story, I realize there are people who may have a serious misunderstanding here. That the covenant of the Torah, as a covenant, covenants are binding, is available to anyone who wants to be bound by the covenant. But anyone who isn't interested is certainly welcome to still fulfill the various component rules of living that are in that covenant, with, again, very, very few exceptions, as acts of personal devotion on a votive basis. I hope that helps to clarify the misunderstandings and uncertainties that pertain to question 1, and I conclude our discussion of it, as always, with my blessings, that we should, each of us, find a way, the right way for each and every one of us, through our acts of devotion to God, to always come closer to Him. There are indeed many paths that can be legitimately taken in coming closer to God. As a member of the nation of Israel, the path for me is through the covenant of the Torah and the rules of living that are in that covenant. It doesn't have to be the path for you. You're welcome, but not required. And we can still march together, shoulder to shoulder, as expressed in Tzfania chapter 3, verse 9, in our serving God together and striving, each of us, in our own ways, to come closer to Him. God bless you.